Hi, welcome. Today we're going to continue on with Chapter 7, talking about consumer surplus. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you. Okay, so we're going to talk about consumer, producer, and the efficiency of the market. We're going to start with consumer surplus in this particular learning objective. So the first thing that we want to kind of define here is that an individual's willingness to pay. So if I asked you how much you're willing to pay, oh, I don't know, for this face mask, think about how much you're willing to pay. Now, again, just like we talked about, everything else other than price changes, how much you're willing to pay. We see price gouging right now. The Attorney General is saying, hey, $28 for this little thing that may or may not help you. So your willingness to pay goes up and down based upon expectations, and some of those things that we have seen will shift the demand curve. So your willingness to pay. So let's think about that for just a moment. And what we're going to say is that it's the maximum amount that a buyer will be willing to pay. Okay. So consumer surplus, and let me see if I can annotate on this. I'm going to use text because to me it just works a little bit easier. But what consumer surplus is equal to whatever your willingness to pay is minus the price. Okay, so consumer surplus will always be positive. It will never be negative, because if you have a negative consumer surplus, you're just simply not going to buy it. Okay, so it will always be a positive number. I like to think of consumer surplus a bit like, let's see if I can do this. Okay, and let's see, the happy feeling that you get from kind of purchasing a good or a service. Okay, so let me just clear this slide. All drawn. Okay, so continuing on, do that. Okay, so here we have an example, and in this example we're going to say it's a record or something that is a collector's item. For example, they wanted me to use an Elvis Presley record, which is perfectly fine. But here we have, and let me just kind of use the mouse to select, we have 4 buyers. We have Taylor, Carrie, Rihanna, and Gaga. Okay, so here's their willingness to pay. Now remember, the willingness to pay talks about market efficiency and this whole idea of welfare economics. So if the market is efficient, Taylor here should definitely, and let's see if I can do this, draw, spotlight, that's what I want, spotlight. Okay, Taylor here should definitely get the album because she has the highest willingness to pay, followed by Carrie, followed by Rihanna, followed by Gaga. So think of it this way, they're standing in line based upon their willingness to pay. Okay, so what's the benefit of participating in the market? Okay, so here's an example of how we would look at this. We would take whatever an individual's total willingness to pay is. So let's see if I can do some drawing on this. Okay, so here nobody's willing to pay more than $100. So if price is greater than 100, nobody here is going to be willing to pay for that. Okay. All right. Okay. Between 80 and 100, let me still use this. Between 80 and 100, Taylor demands 1. So again, highest willingness to pay. If the price is 70 to 80, Taylor and Carrie, and so on. Now, if you look over here at the graph, what you'll see is, and I'm going to try to do a little bit of drawing here, is that the first person's willingness to pay becomes this rectangle, okay? The rectangle that you see right here. So this is Taylor's willingness to pay, followed by then Carrie's willingness to pay. See how we're looking at this very individualized, very marginal, followed by Rihanna's willingness to pay, and then lastly, Gaga's willingness to pay. So in looking at these, what we would say is, if we were to draw, and I'm going to do that right now, a price of $50. Let's just say the price is at $50. And how we measure this is, and let's see, okay, is that Taylor's willing to pay 100, okay? But they only have to pay 50. So this area right in here would be Taylor's happy feelings or consumer surplus, followed by Carrie's happiness or consumer surplus. And again, with Rihanna, because Gaga is only willing to pay 40, she doesn't have any consumer surplus. She just becomes a non-buyer at this point. So what we can do, let me clear this out, is we can calculate that consumer surplus. So in doing so, what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, if the price is 50, let's see if I can get it more to the 50 mark. If the price is 50, there we go, right about there. Then what happens is Taylor's consumer surplus, yeah, let's use that. Taylor's consumer surplus becomes this box, or it becomes, let's see if I can get it up here, or it becomes 100 minus 50 times 1. And so that's going to be $50 consumer surplus for Taylor. Okay? And then we would continue to look at each person's consumer surplus. Okay? All right. Okay. All right. Oops. Okay. Forward. Having a bit of a trouble right here with my, I'm gonna, let's see over here. Okay. I'm a bit of a trouble with this, so I'm gonna go ahead and do that. Okay. So the demand curve, once we have a lot of buyers, flattens out. In this previous slide, you can see how it's really a bunch of tiny, tiny people standing in line, if we look at it very marginally or very incrementally. When we get a lot of buyers, 1,000+ buyers, then essentially what we see is a demand curve like we're used to seeing, and that demand curve looks something like, see if I can do this, something like this. So the willingness to pay is really what these endpoints here, let's see if I can draw that, the endpoints here and here represent an individual's willingness to pay. We're used to dealing with this very flat or non-bumpy, if you want to put it that way, demand curve. And so the demand curve actually makes up a buyer's willingness to pay. Oh, I forgot to erase that. Sorry. Okay, let's do that. Annotate. Okay. Okay. So again, the demand curve shows the willingness to pay by the marginal buyer. And remember that word marginal. The reason that we use that term marginal is because we're saying marginal buyer, right? One incremental buyer. So what exactly is consumer surplus? And consumer surplus is actually the area below the demand curve and above the price. Now, one thing you want to remember is a pretty valuable formula that you probably learned some time ago. And we're going to say that consumer surplus will normally be a triangle. So the formula for a triangle is just going to be 1/2 times 1/2 of the base times the height. Now in econ, we really don't care which you use as base and which you use as height, but always remember to take that 1/2 because a lot of students forget this 1/2 portion of it. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. And again, oops, I keep forgetting to erase all my slides, my slide annotations. Okay, good. Okay, So here, this shows the incremental nature. So as you saw, here's Taylor's consumer surplus if the price is $80. So if the price is $80, then we know, okay, that the consumer surplus, we know that the consumer surplus is 100, what she's willing to pay, minus the 80, which gives us 20 times 1. Okay, so let's just see, make sure we understand where this came from. So again, 100 minus the price, the willingness to pay minus the price of 80 will equal that person, that individual's consumer surplus. So that's where that 20 came from, just so you know. So that's what gave us the $20 consumer surplus that we see here. So that is how we calculated that. All right. Now, what happens if the price changes? What happens if the price goes down? And when the price goes down to $70, so we can take a look at that as well. So if the price goes down to 70, then what we get are two basic things happening. The first thing that we get happening is that because Taylor was willing to buy at 80, she gets an additional consumer surplus. Excuse me. So she gets this amount of additional consumer surplus. Now, how did we get the 30 here? Basically, what we did is the same formula. The willingness to pay, which in Taylor's instance was 100, minus the price of 70, and that equals, that equals the $30. So she gets an additional consumer surplus because she's an initial consumer. She bought it in market A, and she still buys it in market B. But in market B, the price is lower, so she basically gets $10 more of happy feelings, okay? So let's see if I can, I'm working on all this drawing, trying to practice, so bear with me. Here, there we go, okay. Now Carrie drops into the market, so she will be called a new consumer because the price lowered. So Carrie, we can look at her consumer surplus by kind of looking at the same thing. What's the price? What's her willingness to pay? Her willingness to pay is 80. Whoops, not 90, 80. I'll get it. Minus, okay, I'll get it. Typing, camera, everything. Okay. Her willingness to pay is 80. The price she actually pays is 70. So that is the price. Willingness to pay minus price equals consumer surplus. And in this case, it's $10. So that's where this $10 actually came from. And so if we wanted to measure, and I don't like saying the word total consumer surplus, I like saying the sum of consumer surplus because we're going to run into some other terms later on. It can get confusing. So for me, I'm going to rewrite that and I'm going to say, hey, don't say total, say the sum of consumer surplus, and it'll make it a little bit more easier for you to understand. So where did the 40 come from? Taylor's consumer surplus of 30. Spotlight this. Taylor's consumer surplus of 30 plus Carrie's consumer surplus of 10 gave us the total consumer surplus of 40. So there's really two things that happen. When the price goes down, initial consumers, in this case Taylor, because she was a buyer at 80, and she's also a buyer at 70, but at 70, she gets an additional consumer surplus of $10 more. So that's the first thing that happens. Initial consumers get an additional consumer surplus when the price goes down. The second portion is that when we look at this, when the new consumers will come into the market. So for example, as we move from here, because the price went to 70, Carrie was willing to pay 80, so she is a new consumer because the price went down, and she gets a consumer surplus of 10, making the total consumer surplus of 40. Okay, let me clear those drawings. Okay, so what happens? Again, here's the two effects. When a price lowers, it increases consumer surplus. So again, I kind of like to write these and to give you some kind of shorthand to it. I'll do the best I can here. So we can say that as the price decreases, consumer, oh geez, let's see. Oh, there is an eraser. Look at that. Okay. Okay, we'll get it. Consumer surplus increases. Likewise, if the price increases, consumer surplus decreases. Now, what are the two reasons for this? This is what you'll need to know. The two reasons for this are that there's an existing buyers or initial consumers, we'll say it both ways, existing buyers or initial consumers get additional consumer surplus. Okay, so that's the first thing we want to know. Okay, okay, I guess I don't. Okay, the second thing we need to know is that new buyers enter the market and get individualized consumer surplus. Okay, so those are the two things that we really want to remember and recognize when we have a decrease in price. Now, likewise, if we had an increase in price, we would see a decrease in consumer surplus because existing buyers would leave the market and no new buyers would enter into the market. Okay, now we can look at this graphically as well. So here, and this is looking at a price that we have. So let me annotate here a little bit. Okay, so we have panel A, which says, okay, at this price, let's say $50, okay? At $50, and the quantity, let's just keep it simple because I'm all about simple these days, is 100. So what's our consumer surplus? Well, to calculate our consumer surplus, what we need to do is to remember that 1/2 base times height. So remember, to calculate consumer surplus, what we're going to do, or this blue area of the triangle, is we're going to take 50, right? I'm just going to divide the 50 by half right now, which equals 25 times 100. And that's going to equal $2,500. So for this example, the consumer surplus here in blue in panel A, excuse me, is going to be $2,500. Okay, so now the price is going to decrease. Okay, moving to panel B. So let me clear, okay, that. And let's go ahead and talk about panel B. So the first thing in panel B that we see is we still know that this initial consumer surplus is there. Notice the tan. And let's see, there you go. Notice the tan here, initial consumer surplus. We just calculated that. But when the price goes down, and again, let's get some prices in here because I think it makes it just a bit easier to understand. Let's see, text, okay. So if this price was 50, whoops, sorry. Okay, and this price, let's make it 40. Okay. Okay, so if the price goes from 50 to 40, I believe I put quantity down here. Let me put some quantities in here. 100, and let's just say 150. Okay, good. All right. Okay, so now we have some quantities that we can kind of use for our mathematical portion of this. So what happens is now, because the price has decreased from 50 to 40, all right, so we saw that decrease in price. What's going to happen here is that we're going to see that there is additional consumer surplus to initial customers. Okay, that seems really complicated, but it doesn't need to be. So let's talk about exactly what that means. It means that of those buyers that were in the blue triangle in panel A, now they're the tan triangle of panel B. Because the prices went down, they get additional consumer surplus. And how much additional consumer surplus? Well, that would be this. Let's see, that would be this labeled B here. That is the additional consumer surplus to initial customers. Notice it can be a little confusing. So how we're going to calculate that one is just the area of a rectangle. So we know that 50 minus 40 equals 10. And then we're going to multiply it by the quantity here of 100. And so we can say with definitive proof here mathematically that 10 times 100 is 1,000. Okay, so additional consumer surplus to initial consumers is 1,000. Now, remember, because the price went down, new consumers come into the market. So who are these new consumers? The new consumers are this portion right here. Okay, right there. Okay, that triangle. So what we want to do to calculate the consumer surplus to new consumers is we want to be able to calculate that triangle. So to do that, what we're going to do is to kind of measure that triangle, and I'm going to go ahead and put our text in here. Okay, so we're going to say, okay, the length of the triangle, I'm just going to say 50, meaning price 1, minus price 2 is 40, that equals 10. So 10 is a base, and 50 will be the height. So I want to run that through my formula. So 1/2 of 10, whoops, I'm going to do 0.5 times 10 equals 5 times 50. So that equals the new consumer surplus to new customers equals 250. Whoops, not 259, 250. Okay, so hopefully, if you can't see this kind of how it works, please let me know, and I'm trying to, provide you with as much direction as I can. I'd be happy to work out some problems too if you feel that would be helpful to you. Okay, so let me go ahead and erase go ahead and erase this as we move forward. So just to sum up, it's the benefit the buyers get from receiving a good. And it does really measure economic well-being, because an economy is efficient if those that value it most highly get it, according to their willingness to pay. It's interesting, there have been some exceptions. And so, for example, illegal drugs. What's our willingness to pay? What is the price, okay? And again, we know that because of brain development and things like that, what happens is many times that these individuals aren't able to make some rational decision, hence the word addict. So again, when we look at it, we wouldn't lower the price of illegal drugs. We wouldn't lower the price of things that we don't want people to do. Again, what we have called these things in our course are really the idea of disincentives. This is why the marijuana price and so on, sin taxes exist, and we talked about that during elasticities. Okay, that's clear. Okay, so I'm going to stop my share now, come back over here, and hopefully I've given you a pretty good idea about how to calculate this stuff. If not, please contact me, and I'd be happy to work out some other problems for you. In fact, I may just do that. I don't think this is overly complex, but knowing which triangles are initial consumers surplus, knowing which one are additional consumer surplus to initial consumers, that sounds very confusing in and of itself, and which triangle is the additional or new consumer surplus to new buyers. So if you don't have any questions, we're good. Stay well, be safe, and I'll see you soon.